So welcome to this recording on a training on addiction. I'm just going to share my screen to start this slide production. So this is a series on understanding and responding to addiction. And we start with looking at the transition of the idea of addiction being looked at as a substance disorder, that change in language from addiction to substance disorder, because the language did change. It changed to reflect a change in attitude on looking at changing the idea from reducing stigma and to one of reflecting choice. And so there was a lot of thought that if language changed, we could do something to reduce the stigma that surrounded addiction. And the thought was that addiction had some stigma attached with the idea of addiction. And the stigma was attached to that word itself. And that if we changed it to something like substance disorder or substance abuse disorder or substance use, that we would be able to actually change the attitude of people towards addiction. The other thing to note, the changes that have come about recently is changes in the idea that harm reduction has become the more dominant approach, both for economical and humanitarian reasons. And these are because obviously we've had a lot of, one of the biggest challenges lately has been around opiate use and the use of fentanyl and carfentanil and other items that are popping up around the fentanyl drug itself and variants of this that are so very toxic and so very lethal that we saw a huge increase in deaths due to opiates. And so obviously there was an attempt to try and manage this, and harm reduction became extremely important during this time, although it had been important all along, important for trying to reduce people getting illnesses. They're being transmitted by the use of dirty needles that that people were not cleaning or passing illnesses between each other by not having clean needles and clean materials and things like this. And so there was a desire to do that, which a lot of the early harm reduction strategies were around that, making sure that people had clean needles and clean supplies and stuff like that. Also, then that people actually had, could come into a place and have a safe injection site. So if in fact they OD'd, there would be somebody there that could help them. The use of Narcan to bring people back from an overdose, to buy time so that paramedics could come and take people to a hospital so that they could be monitored until they were going to be safe and not return to an overdose and die. So harm reduction has played a big role in actually safeguarding people with addiction so they don't die. And an incredibly important part of providing some chance that people with addiction don't end up dead. Very important. Also became, I think when I say both economical and humanitarian reasons, economically, because I think there was a move away from actually treating addiction from an abstinence-based model. So, treatment became less advantageous because of the fact that a lot of people went to treatment centers and would go through a treatment process. It's very expensive if you have somebody in a residential treatment program, and they go through that program and then they relapse. There was a lot of people relapsing. It's a lot of money to put people through treatment centers. And then if they relapse and they come back, people are coming back many, many times. It's an awful lot of money invested in treatment. And when you're not getting success, that can really drive the cost of treatment up. And so there was that factor that was there as well. The legalization of marijuana, they sought to reduce the criminalization of people involved in substance use. So people that were going to prison or jail for the selling or use of marijuana seemed to be, a little over heavy-handed. And so to reduce that, the legalization of marijuana came into play in hope to reduce that. Also, it was seen as not as serious a drug as other drugs, and there's also the financial aspects of legalizing marijuana. Of course, it's another, certainly a good avenue for earning money. The government took over the sales of marijuana, and certainly using, certainly gaining an income off of taxation, and as they have done so with alcohol and with tobacco and with gambling and with lottery tickets. So there's money to be made also in the legalization of marijuana. We need to be aware of that as well. There is a recognition that people are using substances for a wide variety of reasons that should not leave them criminalized. That's the other aspect of this that we want to keep in mind as we go along. When is a substance use a problem? Obviously, when it interferes with a person's normal activities, or when a person's use while engaging in certain activities makes these activities dangerous to themselves and others. And so you can think of when you're driving a car, obviously. So when somebody's drinking and driving, we've seen some pretty serious problems. Obviously, when someone is using other drugs and driving, these can be just as dangerous. When a person engages in crimes related to their use of substances. So sometimes when people are using substances, they may be more violent. Or when you're using substances that are illegal, they may engage in crimes in order to finance that, or they may engage in crimes related to their selling of these drugs or involved in the drug trades. When a person's behavior while using substances is harmful to others. So when somebody is intoxicated under the influence of substance and they engage in that harmful behavior, they become violent and harm somebody else. When a person is intoxicated by substances and in charge of minor children, certainly there's a lot we've seen a lot of harm done to children when people are intoxicated and they're with children. Example of that, we often think of alcohol in children, but certainly children and adults under the influence of methamphetamine have been pretty horrific situations that we've seen with that. Children can be very harmed by people under the effects of methamphetamine. They often are not fully aware of what they're doing. And there have been a lot of cases where children have died in the care of people under the influence of methamphetamine because these people become extremely psychotic. They're not fully aware of what they're doing. They're not fully in charge of their faculties at that point. They often think things are going on that are not going on. And so that can lead to very traumatic experiences for the children. Additional problems associated with use. So when the use of substances cause noticeable withdrawal effects when not consumed, that can be a problem for people. And then how do they act to manage that? When more and more of the substance must be consumed to achieve the same effect. So this is obviously when tolerance is building up and people are required more to stave off withdrawal and to achieve the effect that the drug used to give them. When use continues despite continual and escalating problems associated with use. So when people are using and they're using it to the point where they're unable to pay their rent or they're unable to manage their life. So even when they can see that their use is causing problems, they continue to use. When more and more time is dedicated to the getting or finding or using the substance. So again, when the normal activities of life are ignored for the sake of trying to get the drug. So suddenly they're not able to function as regular people because now they're obsessed with the drug. And so things that people normally take care of or have to do in the normal events of their life suddenly are just not important anymore. And they're just dedicated to getting and finding that drug. When the overall health or well-being of the person is noticeably impacted. And again, we see this when drug addiction is extreme. And you can see this on the streets of some neighborhoods where people are they've completely lost all sense of reality. Their health is obviously compromised. They look quite ill. You can see that they're not taking care of their health. Their mental health has been compromised. Anyone walking by can tell there's a problem. And they look quite frightening. And so you can just tell it's not hard to see that a person who's been whose health is compromised. It's pretty obvious to anybody walking by. So drugs of abuse, we're just going to go through the drugs, the different drugs, and look at intoxication and withdrawal, so that if you see people, you can kind of figure out just by their behavior or what you're seeing in front of you exactly what's going on, because each drug has their characteristic sort of intoxication look and also has a characteristic withdrawal. So if we look at alcohol intoxication, you will see people whose speech is slurred. They'll have incoordination. They're not managing things normally. They're a bit off. They're not handling, like they may knock things over. They can't hold on to things properly. They have an unsteady gait, so they're kind of like unbalanced a bit when they're walking. The nystagmus is an involuntary eye movement, so their eyes are moving in an abnormal way. They have an impairment in attention or memory. So, you're trying to talk to them. They have difficulty sort of paying attention to what you're saying. They may not be able to remember things that you've said to them or things that you're asking them. And of course, if they drink enough, and you're at 0.4 is a very serious amount of alcohol. Obviously, you would have to have drank a lot, but you can get stupor, coma, or death. And 0.4, although it seems unreasonable, when people, you'll see this with a lot of times college and university, where people are drinking large amounts of alcohol, competition drinking, and all this stuff, and they're drinking very fast. They're drinking a lot of alcohol. They're drinking very quickly. The problem with that is that they can swallow down this great big bottle of alcohol, and at first it will look like they're drunk, but it's not as noticeable right away, because it takes time for the blood alcohol level to rise. So at first it may not look like they're that drunk, but it takes time. And so after they've stopped drinking, the blood alcohol level will continue to rise. And that's the problem, is it can rise quite a lot higher than initially what you think. And that's when you can get these higher levels and you get the possibility of coma and death. Withdrawal from alcohol. So you see sort of autonomic hyperactivity. This is like sweating. They have increased pulse rate. They get a bit of a hand tremor going on. They have insomnia. They have nausea or vomiting. This transient visual, tactile, or auditory hallucinations or illusions. So, they start to see things or hear things. There's psychomotor agitation. They have anxiety. They have generalized tonic-clonic seizures. These symptoms must cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. So this is somebody that's drank for a very long period of time. They've got an addiction to alcohol, and these are pretty serious. And I'll tell you, there's only 2 drugs out there in people's use that will cause death in the withdrawal stages, and one of them is alcohol. So it's very serious. And where you see it serious here is when you start to see this tonic-clonic seizures, because it's the seizures that can bring about death. And you can see how serious it looks, right? You've got this autonomic hyperactivity, so really increased pulse rate, the tremor, the nausea, the vomiting, the hallucinations, the psychomotor agitation, and then you've got these seizures showing up. So very, very serious withdrawal. These people should actually be in a hospital. Usually when you take people off alcohol for the purposes of detoxing them in order to help them enter into a recovery, usually do that in a medical place. You don't usually do it at home. They're usually given something like Valium or another benzodiazepine, and they're taken slowly off of that over a period of time to make sure that they don't go into a seizure, because they can go into a seizure and die. Interestingly enough, what's used to detox them from the alcohol is the other drug that will cause the same problem, death by withdrawal, which is the benzodiazepine. In this case, it's medically given to offset the withdrawal, and it's really watched, so it's very carefully done. Some people give people with an alcoholic problem the benzodiazepines to go home and try and detox from. I would never suggest anyone doing that. I think it should be medically detoxed. People will tell you other than that. Doctors will tell you other than that. I myself would never recommend giving somebody a prescription for benzodiazepines to go home and withdraw from, because many people have died. And based on that, I just wouldn't do it. Cannabis intoxication. So marijuana. So when people are intoxicated on cannabis, you see impaired motor coordination. Again, think about driving, not a really good idea. If they impaired motor coordination and you're driving along and you have to have a quick reaction to something because something happens in the traffic, not a really good idea to be smoking cannabis. And you'll see other reasons for that. Euphoria, anxiety, a sensation of slowed time. Again, not really good if you're driving. Impaired judgment, not good if you're driving. So these are just to think about it. Everyone thinks, when they're smoking cannabis that they have complete control, but that's part of the drug. The drug will lead you to believe that you're doing everything excellently. It's an effect of the drug. So it's important to note that. You may feel like you're the best singer, guitar player, artist, whatever, because you're stoned on pot, but that's the part of the pot. It's the sense that you're doing everything really well when in fact you're really not. Social withdrawal. For some, I don't think for all, but certainly some people become a little bit more self-conscious and then start to get a little paranoid. And so they tend to not want to be around a lot of people. The conjunctival injection. These are simply red watery eyes. So it looks like they have like little red sort of like spiderly looking things in their eyes. Increased appetite, they're very well known. The munchies, most people will tell you that when they smoke pot, they want to eat. Dry mouth and tachycardia. The heart rate exceeds the normal resting rate. There's another thing that people are getting, and I forget the medical name for it, but some people have a tendency to, just some people, not all, to have a vomiting issue around cannabis intoxication. It's not that common, but you do sometimes see it. Withdrawal. So it does have withdrawal, contrary to many people's understanding. So you'll get irritability, anger, or aggression. You have nervousness or anxiety, sleep difficulty. People will have insomnia and disturbing dreams. A lot of drugs, when you stop them, do end up with this disturbing dreams piece, because most drugs will eliminate REM sleep, which is your dream sleep. And so you tend to have a bit of REM rebound when you stop using any sort of drug. So people will tend to have pretty brilliantly, surprising dreams for a while after they stop anything. But, in this case, and we see the disturbing dreams. Decreased appetite or weight loss, because cannabis tend to increase eating. Restlessness, people feel a bit depressed. You see physical symptoms such as abdominal pain, shakiness, tremors, sweating, fever, chills, or headache. And then we go to hallucinogen intoxication, and that covers quite a wide variety of drugs that can cause you to hallucinate. So what you see here is dilated pupils, tachycardia, again, your heart rate is increasing, sweating, palpitations, blurring of vision, tremors, incoordination, marked anxiety or depression, ideas of reference, fear of losing one's mind, paranoid ideation, impaired judgment, subjective intensification of perceptions, depersonalizations, you lose the sense of yourself, derealizations, you lose your connection to the world around you, illusions, hallucinations, synesthesia, which is a cross-sensory perception, which means you see, sound, and hear colors, things like that. Intoxication, you'll get belligerence, assaultiveness, apathy, impaired judgment, dizziness. You see the nystagmus again, the unusual eye movement, incoordination, slurred speech, unsteady gait, lethargy, depressed reflexes, Psychomotor retardation. So people start to slow their movements down. Tremor, generalized muscle weakness, blurred vision, or diplopia, which is double vision. Stupor or coma, and euphoria. If we're looking at opioid intoxication, here you have sort of an apathy or a dysphoria, psychomotor agitation or retardation, impaired judgment, drowsiness or coma, slurred speech, impairment of attention or memory. Often what we would see is we see people kind of nodding off. Essentially there's this huge sort of pleasurable feeling when people first get the initial sense of the drug, specifically when we're looking at injection. And then it's followed by very dreamy kind of drowsiness or this nodding off that we would often see. So they can't seem to stay awake. They're just kind of dropping their head quite a bit. Withdrawal. And again, it's important to note that the withdrawal is often the opposite of the effect of the drug. So they're nodding off and kind of going into a sleep. When they take the drug, okay, here we have the opposite. Dysphoric mood. They're unhappy, uneasy, dissatisfied. There's nausea and vomiting. There's muscle aches, tearing eyes and running nose, pupil dilation, goosebumps, sweating, diarrhea, yawning, fever, insomnia. So they're not certainly nodding off. They're not feeling that kind of, comfortable type of sleep thing. They're not happy in this other state. Everything is aching. They're not happy at all. They're feeling pretty under the weather. It's like a very bad flu. Then we look at sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytic intoxication. And these are the things we're looking at when we're talking about like benzodiazepines, which I mentioned earlier when talking about alcohol. So very, very similar to alcohol. And you're going to see a very similar presentation here as alcohol. So you see the inappropriate, aggressive, or sexual behavior. They're much more intense, actually, than alcohol because they're in a little pill and people tend to take them and they get drunk a lot faster than you would if you were drinking alcohol. So mood lability, mood doesn't match the situation. Impaired judgment, slurred speech, there's your sort of drunk look, incoordination, unsteady gait, nystagmus again, the unusual eye movement, impaired in cognition, attention, and memory. And stupor or coma will come a lot faster because, of course, the whole effect will come a lot quicker. The withdrawal. And here you're going to see a lot more serious than alcohol. Autonomic hyperactivity, sweating, increased pulse rate above 100 beats per minute. So a lot worse. Hand tremor, insomnia, nausea or vomiting, transient visual, tactile, auditory hallucinations or illusions, as I'd mentioned with alcohol withdrawal, psychomotor agitation, anxiety. And here's the big one. Grand mal seizures that affect the entire brain. So just dial it up a lot more than we saw with alcohol, a lot more serious. The other thing that we see with this particular drug, and we saw it a lot with people using these Xanax. There was a lot of Xanax use at one point in time. So these people would do the Xanax and blackout and end up in jail. They'd have no memory of what happened because they'd be using quite a number of these Xanax. And of course, they'd go on almost automatically into blackout and they'd wake up in jail and have no idea what they did. It was that serious. They just, very dangerous to be doing these drugs. Stimulant intoxication. So stimulants, thinking of things like, people that are doing Ritalin, abusing Ritalin, or we used to call them Dexies or uppers or speed or anything in that sort of area. So obviously there's euphoria, affective blunting, reduced emotional response, changes in sociability, hypervigilance, exaggerated sensory sensitivity, and the need to scan for danger. So if you stimulate your system, right, you're turning everything on high. So you're like, you're turning all of your system on high. So you're obviously going to be more hypervigilant. You're going to, everything's on, turned up, interpersonal sensitivity, difficult with the accuracy and interpretation of perceptions, anxiety, tension, anger, stereotype behavior, so repetitive ritualistic movement, impaired judgment, tachycardia. These is where you start to see people get very paranoid. They're convinced somebody's following them, watching them. Intoxication continued, pupil dilation, elevated or lowered blood pressure, perspiration or chills, nausea or vomiting, evidence of weight loss over time because you can't eat while you're on stimulants. It just, takes that away. Psychomotor agitation or retardation, muscular weakness, respiratory depression, chest pain, cardiac arrhythmias. You've turned everything on high. Confusion, seizures, dyskinesia, which is involuntary movement, dystonia, twisting and repetitive movements, or coma. I've seen people like they're just stuck in, they keep moving in the same repetitive movement. It's frightening to see. When you see people that are smoking crack or methamphetamine, it's quite frightening to see them in those states because they look like there's something seriously wrong with them. I've seen people like just stuck in these very odd movements, and it looks like they have a movement disorder. It's quite frightening to see. So here's the withdrawal. Of course, they're turned on high while using what's going to be the opposite of that: fatigue, vivid, unpleasant dreams, insomnia or hypersomnia, increased appetite, psychomotor retardation or agitation. It's not pleasant on the other side. So there's the range of drugs we're talking about. We've looked at them all. So now let's look at the drugs in the brain's neurotransmitters, because to tell you how drugs work, they can't work without you having some natural brain chemicals, because no drug could work in your brain without that being part of your chemistry or part of your anatomy. There has to be some sort of chemical foundations in your brain in order for drugs to have any effect whatsoever. And that's how they're having an effect. We have natural chemicals in our brain that are very similar to the drugs of abuse. And that's how the drugs of abuse are working. They're either mimicking or turning on or turning off the natural chemicals that are in our brain. And that's how they're having an effect. So, and they're called, these drugs in our brain are called neurotransmitters. So we have an electrical and chemical brain interaction going on. And that's how our brain is functioning. It talks to itself through this chemical, electrical sort of communication system. So here we are. Drugs of abuse work because the brain as chemicals very similar to the drugs of abuse. Drugs of abuse either mimic or cause there to be more of the natural chemicals that already exist in the brain. The brain has a chemical system that ensures the species survival that is hijacked by drugs of abuse. And so there's one specific chemical that is very key in this, and this is the dopamine system. And it rewards the things that allow the species to survive. And what are they? Eating and sex, which ensures the immediate survival and the eating, and procreation, which ensures the continuation of the species. And this is part of the effects of all drugs of abuse. So the dopamine. So all drugs of abuse have an effect on the dopamine system. And that's how they get to be so insidious, in that people are so caught by them, because they have an effect on dopamine, and dopamine is our survival neurotransmitter. And so the drugs of abuse trick us into thinking that we need them for survival once we get involved in them. So here we're going to look at some of them. So here's dopamine. Dopamine's function is pleasure and reward. It works on movement, attention, and memory. It's the pleasure and reward part that all of the drugs are obviously tapping into. Drugs that affect the movement, attention, and memory are cocaine, methamphetamine, and amphetamine. And in addition, virtually all drugs of abuse, directly or indirectly, augment dopamine in the reward pathway. And that's your first pleasure and reward. That's the survival pathway. Then we have serotonin. Most people will be familiar with serotonin because it's often used as in antidepressants. It's the one that's often being targeted when you're given an antidepressant. So what does it affect? Mood, sleep, sexual desire, and appetite. So you see the first one being mood, which is why it's often prescribed. Antidepressants are prescribed to affect serotonin. Drugs that affect it are MDMA, LSD, and cocaine. And then norepinephrine. This is its function is sensory processing, movement, sleep, mood, memory, and anxiety. So we also see antidepressants that target both norepinephrine and serotonin. So you'll see them, they'll be targeting both. And again, for that reason, because mood again shows up here as a part of norepinephrine, also anxiety. So drugs that affect it, cocaine, methamphetamine, and amphetamine, and probably around the sensory processing part is what you're looking for if you're looking for it for the high piece of it. Endogenous opioids. So we have a natural opioid system, and we have that so that if we get injured and we need to sort of try and survive until we can get somewhere to have the injury dealt with, our endogenous opioids kick in so that we can actually keep going until we get to some place that we can deal with the injury. It shows up often when people are soldiers in war, for instance, and they may have sustained an injury and they're trying to help their buddy get somewhere, themselves get somewhere. Their endogenous opioids kick in and give them what is almost equivalent to morphine when they're released, and they can actually survive. That's how they can survive a battle, injury, and still get back to their base camp and survive. So what does it do? It's analgesia, sedation, rate of bodily functions, breathing, and mood. Drugs that affect it: heroin, morphine, and prescription pain relievers. So there's your, and of course we prescribe these things when we see people that have pain problems. And of course they cause all sorts of problems because we prescribe them, overprescribe them, and then unfortunately people become addicted to them. Acetylcholine. It affects memory, arousal, attention, and mood, and the drugs that affect it are nicotine. Interesting. And then endogenous cannabinoids and anandamine. It's hard for me to say some of these words, so bear with me. Its functions affected: movement, cognitions, memory. And the drugs that affect this are marijuana. And you see memory in here, and I think it's important to note that because that is something that we see problematically in marijuana use, is it tends to affect memory. And it tends not to be a real plus if you're trying to learn things. So as much as people with ADHD think that it's helpful because it tends to calm them. And so they feel that it's great for ADHD. Its problems here, cognition and memory, don't make it the best solution. And then we have glutamate. It affects neuron activity, so increases, and then learning, cognition, and memory. And drugs that affect it are ketamine, PCP, and alcohol. And again, I'd say not positively affecting that. And gamma or GABA. I'm not going to say this whole name. Well, good. Gamma aminobutyric acid, which is GABA. It affects neuron activity. It slows the neuron activity, anxiety, memory, and anesthesia. And drugs that affect this are sedatives, tranquilizers, and alcohol. So then we move on to mental health. And drugs of abuse and mental health diagnosis. It's because, of course, because the drugs are affecting the brain and these areas of the brain are natural neurotransmitters, they can have an effect on our mental health because often mental health issues have to do with these natural neurotransmitters in our brain, which is why we then get prescribed medications that work on the neurotransmitters in our brain to try and correct problems that are there. Drugs of abuse can be sought out by people suffering with a mental health diagnosis as a way of attempting to manage undesirable symptoms of either their disorder or their medications. So sometimes that's what people are doing. They don't feel well. They happen upon a drug of abuse that makes them feel better, and that's why they're taking it sometimes, at least. Some drugs can cause symptoms that mimic symptoms of a mental health diagnosis. So for instance, if somebody taking a lot of amphetamines can actually become very much looking like someone that is schizophrenic, because they've got all the symptoms of somebody that is, got paranoia that looks very similar to a symptom of somebody with paranoia and schizophrenia, and yet it's not, it's drug induced. Some drugs may bring on a mental health issue that the person may have had a predisposition for, but may not have necessarily manifested if they had not taken the drug abuse. We're seeing this more with marijuana in youth. So some youth will use marijuana and then have an early episode psychosis, and you'll see that there may have been some schizophrenia in the family, and they may never have manifested this had they not been using cannabis. And then suddenly they do manifest early episode diagnosis. And often if you can get them to stop using the marijuana, that'll stop it. But if they continue, you can often see that the episode may turn into a schizophrenia, and then they've got the disorder, unfortunately. Psychosis and drugs of abuse. So stimulants taken in large amounts can bring on a state of psychosis, and people who use these drugs often suffer from paranoia and unreasonable fears that people are watching them and following them. Early episode psychosis has been diagnosed in some youth using marijuana. People experience severe withdrawal from alcohol will experience delirium tremens, which includes terrifying hallucinations. The same is true of those withdrawing from benzodiazepines, and inhalants and hallucinogens will cause hallucinations. So these are all areas where we see sort of a psychosis related to drugs. Depression and anxiety. Many people use drugs to alleviate depression and anxiety, but most drugs of abuse will actually increase both. So here's the problem often, is that people will find something that they think is actually alleviating a problem, but in the long term will actually make that problem worse. So alcohol, for instance, when you first drink a glass of alcohol or two, you feel happier, it kind of makes you feel good. But alcohol, in fact, is a depressant. So in the long run, it's going to increase depression and also anxiety. So it's only the first couple of drinks that make you feel good. This, in fact, is a depressant. So if you drink throughout the night, you will get depressed. And if you drink over time, you will increase depression and certainly anxiety over time. Marijuana is another one. Marijuana feels like it's calming, but over time, it actually increases anxiety. So if you drink or if you smoke marijuana because you have anxiety, it will make you feel calm while you're under its influence. But as soon as it wears off, your anxiety will actually increase to a higher level than it was originally. And certainly over time, it will continue to increase. And depression, the same. It will seem better, but over time, it will increase. So it's the thing that gets people addicted, right? Because in the moment, it feels better. And they won't realize that in the long term, it's increasing. So none of these drugs are designed specifically for any of the reasons people claim they use them for. And so they do a lot more than what people think they are taking them for. And remember that any drug is not one specific drug. So marijuana, for instance, has got over 400 different chemicals in it. So what is what's the 400 chemicals doing? They're not only doing one thing. So it would be important to think about that. When people are designing drugs for antidepressants or whatever, they're narrowing the range of those drugs so that they're cleaner. They're not as widespread as the, say, marijuana might be. Drugs like alcohol and benzodiazepines, taken over a long period of time, can cause neurocognitive decline. That's unfortunate. For those who already have a neurocognitive deficit, these drugs can make things considerably worse. So if you're starting off with a brain that's already been damaged to some degree, continuing to use something that's going to cause some decline is only going to make matters worse, right? whenever an individual has a compromised brain, drugs of abuse can put that person at greater risk for additional damage. So if you have a brain injury, using drugs or alcohol that assault the brain is not going to be good for that brain injury, right? People with acquired brain injury are at greater risk of further damage if they are using drugs of abuse. Individuals who have fetal alcohol damage are also at risk when exposed to alcohol or benzodiazepines due to the damage already caused to the brains by alcohol during development in utero. So not a good idea for that group because there's already damage done by the very drug that you're considering using. Incarceration. So alcohol, drugs, and incarceration. A large portion of those incarcerated were often under the influence when they committed their crimes. So there's direct connection. And alcohol's played a big role for a lot of people who were incarcerated. And many have had fetal exposure to drugs or alcohol, which has increased the fact of being incarcerated. Children who grow up in the chaos of an addicted family often suffer from personality disorders and struggle through their lives as a result. And many adult children also end up incarcerated. Drugs as the new medicines. So cannabis has risen as a drug with new medicinal possibilities for its THC and its CBD. Containing over 400 chemicals, there is more potential research to be done. Ketamine has been used in a one-time infusion to illuminate suicide ideation in those who are chronically suicidal. Hallucinogens are being explored for their spiritual and healing properties in depressed people. So we see a lot more openness to exploring different drugs for their potential possible uses in medical and research. When use becomes problematic. So when use begins to become a problem, people naturally try to engage in harm reduction techniques. So they may limit the number of days a week that they use, or the number, quantity that they use. I mean, this is naturally what people do before even seeking any help. They might take days off from using, or they take using holidays. They may use things of lesser strengths, or they substitute items that are similar but less potent or not potent. They may change drugs or beverages. They may try to stop completely when harm reduction doesn't work. So when harm reduction strategies don't work, abstinence may be the only strategy left. This doesn't mean that it is instantly successful either. So many people try to become abstinent, not only struggle from one relapse to another, because relapse is not uncommon. Relapse prevention programs can help people reduce relapse, but relapse is still common, as it is with any other chronic disease or illness. So it's important to recognize this. It's not unique to addiction. Take any other illness that's chronic and you're going to see a lot of relapse. So, people act like addiction is the only chronic illness that has a huge amount of relapse. No, any chronic disease does. So it's not uncommon. Recovery requires support. So key to recovery is support, and support is available through self-help groups. So there are many more new self-help groups available today than there used to be. So at one time, there were only 12-step groups, and not everyone was comfortable with these. And people have a lot of difficulty at times because they sort of think that 12-step groups have a religious component. And there is something to be said about that. There's certainly a sense of that. It depends on how you interpret it. And certainly people that are having a hard time admitting that they have a problem and not really wanting to get help with it can, over-exaggerate that. So you can, play it down or over-exaggerate it depending on where you're at in your life, or you can simply go and get the help that's there and appreciate the fact that there's a lot of other people like yourself that are trying to do the same thing, and that can be helpful. So although they still remain the majority, the 12-step groups, and hands down, they provide some of the best support, there's other groups now cropping up all over the place. So there's smart groups, which are really available. They're online, they're in-person groups. There's secular recovery groups. There's other types of groups that are out there that support people with addiction. And the key is support. You really need other people to help you through this. Most people don't do well doing it alone because there has to be change in personality, because unfortunately intoxication causes people to develop personality traits, attitudes, and behaviors that are not really attractive. And so one not only has to stop using drugs and alcohol, one also has to change attitudes and behaviors, and they're a lot harder to change. Post-acute withdrawal. So this is something that happens after you stop using. So after the initial withdrawal from one's use, there is a prolonged withdrawal that involves the brain returning to normal after having been altered by the presence of chemicals that the brain altered itself to accommodate for. So that's the fact. If you use something for a long period of time, the brain will try and accommodate the presence of that by altering itself so that it can still function reasonably well, even though you've put a lot of very damaging chemicals into it. So it's going to try and alter itself to maintain its balance and its ability to function, so that you don't end up, falling off a cliff, or, be unable to walk or talk or whatever. So it does a lot to alter that so that you can still function. So you have an altered brain when you stop using, and it has to go back to normal, and that takes time. So the brain is always trying to maintain homeostasis or optimum balance for survival. And so when we take chemicals that affect the brain tries to compensate by changing things to return things to normal, which is how tolerance occurs. The brain is deactivating the drug to return us to proper functioning, to make sure we survive and don't die from some accident caused by the drug's effects. So here's the symptoms that we see. So there are 6 of them. There's an inability to think clearly. So there's poor concentration, difficulty with abstract thought, rigid and repetitive thinking, tunnel vision, and thought disorders. There's memory problems, so short-term memory problems. People have difficulty recalling significant events when stressed. They have trouble remembering something that you said 5 minutes ago. Emotional overreaction or emotional numbness. So people's emotions are all over the place. They react hugely to small things, or they're numb and can't react at all, but the emotions are very unstable. Sleep problems, they can't fall asleep, they can't stay asleep, they can't wake up, they're sleeping for prolonged periods at odd times of day, they never feel rested, they have disturbing dreams, really problematic. Physical coordination, they're off balance, they knock things over, they're clumsy, they're staggering, they look like they're drunk, stress sensitivity, they can't manage stress, they're frightened, they feel they're going to lose control, their stress is not manageable, they don't know what to do, they can't, deal with it at all. Small stress blows them out of the water, big stress, they're not reacting at all. So all these things just make them life not manageable, and stress just drives everything out of the water. So you need to figure out some way to managing this. And it depends, this all depends on how long you used, what you used, the age you started using it. All these are going to factor in on how bad these symptoms are, and then how long it's going to take for them to go away depends on what you do in the recovery portion. So how do you recover? The brain has been injured. So how are you going to make the brain better? What are you going to do to help that brain recover? So it's going to need time, and it's going to need a recovery program that's going to include things that are make the brain better and healthier. So here we go to recovery. What do we do? So we were living in an unhealthy way when you're using substances. You're not taking good care of yourself. You're not eating properly. You're not, exercising. There's a whole lot of things you're not doing. So here's the recovery program that does help. So nutritional eating 3 meals, eating healthy food, because you're trying to build back the neurotransmitters in your brain, and you can't do that if you don't eat, because that's where the building blocks come. And so you're going to have to eat, not only eat well, but eat healthy foods, and you eat at least 3 meals a day, eat 3 healthy snacks, reduce sugar, nicotine, and caffeine, because they all increase cravings, because they're addictive as well. They have addictive qualities to them. Do some healthy activity and exercise. So aerobics, yoga, tai chi, things that reduce stress, elevate your mood. You need relaxation, meditation, and mindfulness. This is to deal with the stress that you can't seem to control. stress management. So find techniques that help reduce stress, problem solving, learn how to sit down and solve a problem so that you don't get your stress levels up. How do you actually solve a problem? Work that out. Structured living, how to develop a weekly schedule and includes recovery activities and creates accountability for yourself. Recreation, how to learn how fun without using, how to alleviate boredom so you don't feel like you want to use because you're bored. The self-help groups that you can attend, how to find them, where to go, put them on your daily schedule. Journal writing, how to write down your successes and your challenges and problems and triggers and feelings and goals and things, and keep track of stuff that you're trying to work on. Reading meditational readings and affirmations, because you probably don't have a very good sense of yourself, and you're trying to get some positive thoughts there and trying to put some positive thinking into your head. Medical and psychiatric evaluation. You might want to check out to make sure you're okay. Do you have any mental health issues? Do you have a concurrent disorder? Do you need medication? How's your physical health? Is there any issues that need to be taken care of? Ongoing counseling, go to therapy. Address some of the issues that made you turn to drugs or alcohol. Make sure that stuff is not, coming up and you're not dealing with it. Make sure that you take a look at that. Join a group therapy, because that's some of the best type of therapy you can do. In the presence of other people, you can learn a lot more about yourself. Meaning making or spiritual exploration, try to make sense of yourself in this world. We don't live alone in the world. Try to understand what your meaning is in this life. It's a great thing to do for yourself. Creativity, finding something that you can do. Find out about yourself. What are you capable of doing, and engage in that. And then we have harm reduction. Harm reduction, again, as I said earlier, is extremely important. What you're seeing here is a nasal applicator for Narcan. So this is can be put just up the nose, and you give it one pump, and you've administered a Narcan dose to somebody that is OD'd. So these are really helpful. Number of strategies have been employed to reduce the deaths and infection in people using drugs. Needle exchange program, so handing out of clean needles to prevent diseases, and needle disposal containers to reduce the number of discarded needles on the street. Methadone and Suboxone as opiate replacement therapy. Allow people to stop using street-level opiates and prevent opiate overdoses by fentanyl. There's a managed alcohol program where people who are very late in their alcohol use and are unlikely to ever stop drinking can get a drink an hour in the shelter to keep them from dying on the street. Antabuse is a medication that prevents the metabolization of alcohol, thereby causing a person to become profoundly ill when they drink. So if they take the antabuse, that prevents them from choosing to drink. Crack pipe exchange prevents diseases passed through cuts or burns on the mouth when passing pipes between users. So if they they can get another pipe, they don't have to pass that on. And of course, the naloxone kits and naloxone training, like we saw in the picture, administered either intranasally or intramuscularly, and can reduce overdose. You can get these at the pharmacist, and they can give you some training on how to use them. So they're really important. If you have somebody in your family or somebody that you know, or you yourself are a person using opiates, it's important to carry one of these with you. If you can't administer it, somebody else can do that for you. The reason for a person's use. It's important to understand that what the purpose of a person's use is in serving, what's it serving, because that is the concern that needs to be resolved, or the person's just going to return to use, right? So if a person has social anxiety and the drug use has allowed them to go out and meet people and make friends, and when they didn't use, they couldn't do this, stopping use will return them to their previous isolated state. You're going to have to help them resolve that. The underlying issue. This is the difference between success or failure. People use drugs for a reason, usually because they worked. You need to find out what they were working for, see if we can find a way that is less harmful for them. We have to accept that a person's use had some real purpose to it, that it was an answer to a problem that they had no answer for at the time, and that it actually worked for a time. That they themselves may not even know what it was, but only found that they liked it and it felt good, and then we need to explore this with them. Client has all the answers. Our job is to help the client get to know themselves and figure out why they needed the drug use to get by, what it was doing for them, and together, whether we can come up with a better way to do that that's less harmful to them. In the end, it's the client that must make their decision as to what they want to do. But we can offer them the information they might not be aware of. We can support them through their decision-making process in a non-judgmental way. So these are the sources that I drew my information from. One of them that I think is extremely important is the ACE study and the role of trauma and addiction. I really urge people to take a look at the ACE study. It really shows trauma as the core reason why people engage in addiction. And I think it's really important for us to understand that people don't use for no reason, and for often the reason is trauma. And it's a really important piece of information that if we understand that, then we're that much farther down the road on how to actually work with people with addiction. And so hopefully that helps people understand some of the background on addiction and some of the information that might help you better understand the people that you're working with. And you have time, take a look at any of these resources. Again, the other one is Facing Addiction in America, the Surgeon General's report. Another very good piece of information that provides a lot of the background sort of neuroscience on addiction. Again, shows what is really going on in the brain, but well worth looking at any of these sources. So I hope you found this information to be somewhat helpful for you, and that it gives you more information on helping people with this problem. Thank you.